Eddie, thank you for coming onto the podcast. Everybody knows your name in the Keys. You fished tournaments forever, and as I made mention to some of your, fellow peers, Harry Spear, he said Eddie Wightman was one of the greats, and there were only a handful of them. You've got a lot of respect from all the guys that you used to fish against and with.
That's kind coming from Harry.
Yeah, I mean, you were a guy that did well in the tournaments. You won a bonefish tournament, I think, the Fall Fly in '89 and the Gold Cup in '75 with Carl Navarre. But before we go there, it's June 3rd, 2022, in the middle of a tropical storm, which you're very familiar with. You were born in Miami in 1941. Tell me about that transition to the Keys. But right now, since we're in the middle of a tropical storm, tell me about Donna in 1960 that wiped out a big part of Isla Mirada and half of Billy Knowles' family.
You want to start with Donna?
Sure.
Well, Donna, was the second strongest storm since the 1935 storm. And at that time, my family had a house right on the beach in Isla Mirada where right down about 3/4 of the way to Bud Mary's on the ocean, where not the La Siesta, what's that motel? I can't remember, it's been so many years ago. Lindbacks owned it. But anyway, we had the house right next door, and it was a 1-story all cypress house. And then my dad built an addition to it with 2 bedrooms where my sister and I had the bedrooms, and those were concrete. So after the storm, my dad and mom went to Miami and escaped. That
was after the storm?
No, before the storm.
Oh, before, okay.
My mother and dad, they left the Keys, and I went and stayed with my then fiancée. Her father had a house on the top of the hill in Plantation Key Colony, and it was like 15 feet high on the top of that hill. And it was supposedly constructed it was all adobe brick, and it was supposed to be, at those days, bomb-proof. And so I said, I don't need to go to Miami. I'll stay right here with them. And I did, and the house didn't sustain any damage at all. I mean, screen porches got torn off, but, trees got toppled. But all around us, the roofs were off the old 40s and 50s houses, and there were 40, 50-foot boats sitting in the middle of U.S. Highway 1 out in front of the pay fair. And then many of them, and there were the charter boats that got left in the slips at what's now Holiday Isle or Postcard Inn, they got thrown right over the top of the highway. And the Reef Corsair was a 55-foot, I think it was a 55-foot North Carolina wooden boat owned by Hugh Brown. And it ended up halfway out to Crab Keys sitting on the bottom. And another one ended up in the little island that's, right across from Postcard Inn now, there's a little island where the FWC has their docks. There's a little island behind that's called, I can't remember what the name of it is, but one of the 35 or 40-foot charter boats ended up in the mangroves right square in the middle of it. So that's how high the water was and the waves were.
I heard people were found out by flamingo. I think some of Billy Knowles' family were found out there.
In 35, they were all over the back. 35 was really bad. I mean, but, the construction back then was just not anywhere near it is. And the construction today is so much better than it was in 1960.
Sure. What did that storm sound like when it started to get...
Sounded like a freight train. It sounded like a freight train, and there were supposedly gusts. I remember that's when the lighthouse was manned, and those guys stayed in the hurricane, and they said the thing was whipping around like a noodle, and they were afraid it was going to collapse. And some of them got where they were losing their mind. I mean, they survived it, but it was blowing. They said the anemometer ripped completely, the frame ripped off the lighthouse, and it was reading 186. That's what,
Wait, when you said that they were found in Flamingo, they were in their homes?
They were in their homes, and when the roofs got torn off their houses, these people got flung into the air, and that storm took them all the way out towards
I'm not
Flamingo.
sure that was Donna. I think that was 1935 when most of that was. I don't remember. There were some that were found clear back Cluett Key and all the way back in there.
Right.
Years later, they found traces of them.
Right.
But the 35 was the really bad
That
one.
was the one.
Yeah, that's the one where it blew the train off the thing, and all the native families, lost their homes. I think Richie Russell, my wife could remember, when he did his talk, he said they had, I think there was 22 members. I'm trying to remember what he said. There was like 22 members of his family before the 35 storm, and after that there was 18 gone.
Oh my God.
Some crazy number like that. I don't remember exactly what he said. But
Well, we had Irma come through here a couple years ago, and
that was a summer squall. There was nothing to it. That was nothing. I mean, really, I tied my boat up in the slip, and it rode it out just fine.
I think Everglades City was where it really got hit terribly, but also Little Palm Island just got devastated. It took them 2 years to rebuild.
Well,
that.
there's a big difference between the Upper Keys and the Lower Keys. The Lower Keys got slammed.
Yeah, they
I mean,
did.
they really got slammed.
Yeah.
My doctor is Charles Troxel, and he lives on Big Pine, and his office is clear out by the highway, and it's up about 6 feet, and it devastated his office. It ripped the boards off of it and everything. And he said that out on the ocean side of Big Pine Key, they had 20, 21 foot tide surges.
Oh my God.
So it was right up in the second stories of stilt
Yeah,
houses.
buildings.
And
Yeah.
they were, a lot of them were flattened.
Yeah.
They got hit really hard. It didn't happen up here. I mean, I've been through every storm since 49 here and never left. And looking around here, I don't think the winds were probably over 120 at the most.
Right. Do you ever leave prior to big storms coming, or do you?
Oh, yeah.
You button down.
Well, when Irma came, remember when Irma first came up through Hurricane Alley down there, they were forecasting it to be a Category 5.
Right.
And when they're calling for Category 5 and it's aimed right at me, I'm out of here.
Right. You're smart.
I'm out of here.
Well,
And this house, I built this house in 78, and I built it to be a bomb shelter. It's not solid poured concrete, but it's close. The roof is 8 inches of solid poured concrete. The roof is not going to blow off.
Right.
So you were born in Miami. When was the transition to come down to the Keys?
We moved. I think we finally moved down here. We were coming down every weekend. My father had a masonry stone business in Miami, and he had some real problems with his then partner, and to the fact where the stress in his business, his doctors told him at the time that he needed to get away from that situation. He needed to get out of that business, and he needed to leave it or else. So they made the decision to get out, to dissolve the partnership, get out of Miami, and move to the Keys, where we were coming down to where my uncle lived on Lower Matacumbe, and they didn't know what they were going to do. So they took their money from selling the business, and right in the middle of Islamorada, there's a building on the right, the town of Islamorada. It's American Caribbean real estate now. But they moved in there, and my dad opened up what he called a patio shop. And they sold outdoor furniture and all kinds of gifts and stuff for patios. And my mother had been a career hairdresser her whole life in New York City and Miami. And so she opened, there were, stores there. So she opened a beauty shop right next door to the patio shop. It was called the List Building. Then it was built by Peter List. And she opened a beauty shop, and she did very well, and she got very, much in demand, and she worked on people like Mrs. Truman and people like that Clara Mae Downey that started the what's now Chico Lodge. So she had some pretty famous clients, and they ended up opening 5 different beauty shops in the Keys, from Marathon all the way to Ocean Reef Club.
You never saw yourself as a hair designer? You say that, but you said that guiding and fishing found you.
Well, my parents,
and you were here at 8 years of age.
My parents
you went to high school here, right?
My parents said, you need to. They tried to get me to be a hairdresser, and I said, that's never ever going to happen. You will die, but something long before you're ever going to see that. I don't want any part about it. And I said, it's just, I can't do it. I can't do it.
Right.
So he said, but there's big money in it. And my dad used to say, there's only two things if times gets really tough. Women are always, you got to have a grocery store, and women are always going to have their hair done. I said, well, and they did very well at it, but it wasn't cut out for me.
Were you fishing in Miami? Were you passionate about fishing at a young age?
No, because we lived inland, and there was the closest thing to water was a drainage ditch, and I didn't get into that until I got down here. And then how I got into, when I was going to high school down here, like I said, we were owned the property next to La Siesta, is where it is. We owned that house right there. And every afternoon after school, if the tides were low rising, the bonefish would tail right alongside of our house. They'd be tailing right along there. So I started waiting for bonefish, much to my mother's chagrin. She used to just raise hell with me because she'd go to do the laundry and there'd be dead shrimp and crabs rotting in my pockets. And I used to, when the tides were right, I would wade all the way down to Bud and Mary's and back.
What were you catching them with then?
Spinning rod and a crab.
Yeah. Is that when you thought that I really love this? Did you get it right away?
Or I was just pretty aware that I loved to do that. And then, as I got up to be an older teenager, I went to work on the charter boats because I could make some money that way. But I never really took to offshore fishing, even though I know how to do it. I always liked the flats. And then Carolyn says that I didn't find fishing. Carolyn said that. She said, fishing found you.
And why did she say that?
Because
you were just exposed to it.
I loved the fishing. I loved the challenge of it. And back in those days, it was a challenge and it was fun. I mean, there wasn't the dog eat dog that there is today. I mean, you couldn't make me go back to guiding today. And it's not because of the fishing. And I was really fortunate in that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I got to experience. There was a really heavy volume of fish still here, right. And the advent of the new technologies of the new flats boats and the graphite. Remember the first graphite rods? I was just looking at a picture that we maybe you've done it too, but we've taken all these boxes and boxes of slides and everything, and we've done a thing called Legacy Box where they put it all on digital and you get it all on a little,
Right.
So we were looking at some the other night trying to identify him, and there was a picture of Carl Navarre at one of the tarpon tournaments beside a big tarpon, and he had a white fiberglass Shakespeare fly rod.
That
was the best there was.
That's dating it, right?
Yep. And not an ugly stick. White fiberglass. That was the best there was.
At what age did you build your own skiff?
I built my first skiff, or I rebuilt my first skiff. Right after Hurricane Donna, I had graduated from high school and I was going to the University of Florida, and I thought I wanted to be an architect. But I got in one semester, and then Donna came and wiped out my parents'. We didn't have a home anymore. We wiped out the business. The business was gutted. We didn't have anything to do, so I went to work. And, I went to work on the charter boats and did surveying, pumped gas, whatever it took. And all the while I was fishing, and I started guiding, and I got my license, and Billy and I got our license in '61 after the storm.
You talk Billy
Knowles.
Yep.
And we both, we grew up together.
Right.
And we're all in the same graduating class and fought over the same girlfriends, and things like that. There was only about 10 girls in the whole town at that time.
Well, so since Bill, hang on one second here. You're talking about Billy here. What kind of a relationship did you have with Billy? What kind of a guy was he in your eyes?
He was a good guy. I grew up with him since grade school, and then all through high school, and I was a quarterback of the football team, and Billy was on the line, and and just we were buddies. And I think one of the first times I can remember going into the backcountry of any distance other than Crab Keys is that Billy decided and invited me to go. We were going to go camping. And he said, my dad has showed me how to get back to what was called the Samphire Keys, which is right off the right-hand side of In Key, which is like halfway back to Flamingo. And I never been back there before. And Billy, I think, had been there twice with his father. So we went back there and we went camping, and we pitched a tent on there and built a big fire. And we got up the next morning, and it was all the way around. It was dead mosquitoes about that deep. The mosquitoes were so bad, I don't know how we ever stayed there. But that was my first foray into the backcountry. And I knew I loved it. I loved it because it was isolated. It was quiet. People were not around.
Right.
You'd hardly ever see a boat back there in those days.
How hard was it navigating without any sort of navigational equipment? You have a lot of shallow banks out there. How often do you run aground?
Well, I didn't run aground because I knew how to read the water. It's one of the first things you need to learn is how to read the water.
Shallow water.
Yeah, and
ripples.
Yeah, and back in the early days, we didn't have any power trims. You ran aground.
Right.
And once the power trims came out, and you could trim out instead of slowing down or going back, you just floor it and trim it out and go over it. And
so how many of those motor scars are yours?
None.
You're pretty conscious. None.
No, I tell you, I go back, my first boat I built, it was an old Ramsey molded hull. I don't know if you ever heard of them or not. They're like a Nova Scotia hull, but they were built in Miami in those days. And I found a wrecked one after the storm, and I rebuilt it into a skiff. I still have pictures of it. And I'd made, in those days, the guides used to have fishing chairs, and I'd made them out of a piece of, a deck flange and a piece of 2-inch galvanized pipe, and I'd strapped a lawn chair to the top of it.
Perfect.
And my first Willie boat, I've still got the paperwork. I got a custom built 18-foot Willie boat, and I think the price unpainted was $600.
And that was the popular boat, right? It was an all-wooden boat.
That was the Rybovich of the skiffs.
Right.
Everybody tried to have them that could buy them.
Well, before we go any farther, I want to mention the pulling platform. You made mention of that before the podcast started. But so you were a kid, you had shrimp and crabs in your pocket, and you were wading off these tailing bonefish. What was the progression like to get into fly fishing? Did you have friends that, kind of pushed each other? Did you have a mentor? How did you up the skill and say, I want to start fly fishing for these bonefish? I want to start, going after permit, start doing more challenges.
No, I think I evolved into the fly fishing all on my own because I liked the challenge of it. And in those days, you used to do anything you could. You'd go out and catch, you'd go backcountry fishing, you'd go spin cat. Most everybody used spinning cat. But I evolved to the fly right away to the point where halfway through my career, I did nothing but fly fishing.
Was there anybody else doing fly fishing? Any other anglers?
It was in its infancy. Bart Foth, the guy he was one of the first serious people that I can remember that fly fished, and he did a lot.
What year is this when you started fly fishing?
Oh, it had to be probably in the late 70s, early 80s. I'm just guessing. I told you I was bad about dates.
Yeah, well, no problem, because I know that Joe Brooks caught his first bonefish in the early 60s down here.
Well, Joe Brooks was an early pioneer. You asked me when did it start taking off.
Right. Well, so people had been doing it previously.
Yeah, there's some people had done it.
Yeah.
And it's a funny aside on that, when we first went, Carl Navarre and I were the first ones to go to Homosassa. And at that time, there was the famous guide up there was Eustace Locklear. And we took her. Oh,
no, Useless. What's his real name?
That was his name.
Useless.
Not useless. Useless. It wasn't useless, but it sounded that way.
Okay, because there's another Locklear I remember up there. Was that a relationship to him?
Probably one of his sons or grandsons.
Right. So anyway, you went up there.
But I went up there, and he was the local expert, and we started asking him about, where the tarpon were, and because they'd go out there with plug rods. And we said, well, we want to try to catch one on a fly. And he said, well, I know fellers tried that, but ain't nobody ever going to catch a tarpon on a fly rod. I remember that to this day. I said, well, we'll prove you wrong.
Had you been catching a bunch of tarpon prior going up there? Were you looking for records at the time?
Yeah, we went up there. Looking. We had heard, Carl through his contacts had heard that about these huge, big amounts of tarpon and the size of some of them up there through Lefty Cray. Lefty Cray was the editor of the fishing editor of Tampan Tribune in those really early days, pre Homosassa.
Right.
And he'd gotten, and there was only two, according to Lefty, nobody knew anything about them. There was two guys that fixed it, Mr. Lemasters from L&M Lures, at that time, the Mirror guy, and he was friends with a doctor or a dentist out of Tampa, and they had fished them for years, and they kept it quiet, and then it got leaked out, and the rest is history on that.
So Lefty's article he wrote that kind of
Well,
opened the floodgates.
No, he actually called, as I remember. He didn't. I don't know what he wrote, but he and Carl were friends, and he called Carl and told him. He said, "You need to go up there and check it out." So Carl told me. I said, "Sure." So we strapped the boat on the back of the truck and took off, and we went up there. And we had a little sketch of going into where Bayport is.
Yep.
That's where they sent us first, not up to the fancy inn. And we put the boat in there. It was almost black dark in the morning, and it says hazard area on this little chart. And we go, "What does that mean?" And so we idled out this channel goes out forever because it's shallow in the Gulf. And we still didn't know what the hazard until the sun came up, and we could see all these great big black rocks sticking out all over the place. So if you ever hit one of those things, you would totally
toast.
Total. But that was my first thing there. But we can get back to your original.
What was your first morning like there?
Well, we went up there and we didn't know anything, and nobody else nobody knew anything about where they were. So we went up there, and I started guiding like I guided here. I'd go to that big channel up there, and I'd pull around in that, and I'd go stake out on points and wait for them to come by and get on edges and things like that. Didn't see anything. There was nothing. I go like, "What the hell's going on?
Where are they?"
I said, "Carl, we need to go rent an airplane, and we need to go rent an airplane right now when the tide's coming in." He said, "Okay." So we drove south to this, I don't know, it was a little airport down there somewhere, and he found a guy with a Cessna and a pilot, and we went up and flew, and we did run up and down the shoreline, didn't see anything. I said, "Move offshore." So he kept doing a grid like this up and down, and all of a sudden we got where they are now. I mean, you've fished there many times. We got that far offshore, and I go like, "Holy shit. Here they are." They're just way far offshore because the Gulf tapers out so slowly as opposed to here. And later on, after I had fished them along, I discovered that there was a actual underwater sand ridge, and they would follow that depth. It only dropped off about a foot, but they would follow it. And what we did was, I said, well, there was no GPSs in those days. I said, how are we going to find this? So that's when we first started staying at the Riverside Inn. And I went back in the kitchen, and I said, "What do you do with your used gallon jugs that you use for, French fries and all?" He says, "We throw them out there in the back." I said, "Can I have some?" He said, "Sure, take them." So I went and got about 10 or 12, grease jugs. And I went and got some monofilament and some sinkers, and I tied lines to them. We got in the plane the next day, went out and found the fish and started dropping jugs. And I ran straight out the next morning until I found the first jug and started pulling.
And unfortunately, that's how Jim Brewer died. They were
correct.
throwing jugs out of the airplane just prior to the Gold Cup, and one of the lines got caught. No, I think it was a non-stall plane, and it got too steep in a turn. It fell through the lift.
That was all the speculation. I was the first one. I had to go. I was the only one that would go. Went and identified them in the morgue. That was not any fun. I couldn't.
Right.
Nobody else would do it, so I went on it.
Yeah.
I was the president of the association at that time. That's how I got drafted. But they'd been in the water for quite a while, and the crabs had eaten all their eyes out. And
Right. But it was interesting how a number of people were identifying locations by dropping jugs out of airplanes and whatnot.
Well,
What an ingenious way to do it.
Well, they were there.
Worked.
It worked. And you could go out at first light and you could find them because you know about where they were.
Right.
There were no GPSs or anything like that. I never even owned the whole time I guided, I never even owned a compass.
And how many years were you guiding?
53.
53. Well, Nikki brought up a topic earlier about a polling platform. And you said when you first started polling, you used to pull off the bows and then off the cowlings of the motors. How did this platform come to be?
I just got, we were running inline Mercury, 6-cylinder Mercuries in those days. And, they were tall and they were narrow. And I'd stand on that. Most of the time I'd put the lower unit down where I could stand on a flat top. But you're dragging the whole lower unit then. So it's harder than, I was 35 years old then. So I was pretty agile. I only weighed 150 pounds. And so one day I got the idea. I said, what if I just built like a little platform over the motor? And so I did that. I went to the local hardware store and I bought some 3/4 rigid aluminum pipe and I bent 2 legs down in a flat spot and threw a piece of plywood on top. And I used that and it worked fine.
And you showed it to Bill Curtis or something? And he said, What is that, a cleaning station?
Yeah, well, I broke that one. Because it was, it wasn't anything near as strong as the ones they're building today. This was homemade. And I broke that one and I threw it behind my house. And Bill Curtis came to visit me one day and he saw it behind the house. He says, what is that? Some kind of a fish cleaning table? And I told him, no. I said, that's what I stand on the pole now. And I got another one on my skiff. I said, you can see it out front. And he said, can I have it? And I said, sure, take it. I don't care. I don't have any use for it. It's broken. So he took it to Miami, and he was working with Hughes Boat Company in those days. And he took it up there, and he showed it to Bob Hughes, and they saw the future in it. Bob Hughes took it to what was, I think it was called pipe welders. I think they're still built towers. And they built the first prototype, and everybody's got one now.
Right. But he got the credit.
Yeah, they got the credit. Well, nobody actually got the credit.
Well, they say Bill Curtis designed the first polling skiff.
Yeah, well, he designed it off the one I built.
Well, there's another thing that's kind of interesting to Nicky
I never cared about notoriety.
Right, but and I get that. I think that's why a lot of people respected you so much. And but there's one other question here. You said that you came up with this knot, which was a figure 8. 2 knots combined is a bimini twist. Take the double line through the figure 8.
I call it a nail knot.
Yeah, right.
Same thing.
Right, and then
except it's got one more wrap.
Right, and then you have a couple, half hitches on the back end of it in a risotto knot, which is basically a Huffenagel.
Yeah.
But you found that too on your own.
As far as I know.
Do you remember when you designed?
And I started showing it, and I think the first guy I showed it to was Cecil Keith, and he said, "What the hell's that?" And I said, "Well, I wanted 2 more inches. It was always hard to get the maximum, to get it up tight." And I said, I kept fooling with it. And I just decided to tie, this is what I came up with. I said, you could tie a figure 8, if you want to call it, over the double line, somewhere down the length of the double line. Then you slide it all the way up till it butts up against the wraps.
Right.
And then you just tie half hitches. And I said, you gain 1.5 inches, 2 more inches of a bite tippet.
Right. So the people who don't understand what we're talking about, in fly fishing, IGFA fly fishing and tournaments, off your fly, you have up to 12 inches, including the knots. And that 12 inches could be any size of monofilament or even wire. But from that point up,
that's correct,
you have your class tippet. So we're talking about the bite tippet here. So I think trying to find a knot that you're going to get your bimini twist, in the past, it was never really butted up. So that's what you were doing, is trying to get all that the distance tightened up.
Right. Get the double wrap and the knot over in to be as small as I could get it. So I get a longer piece of 100-pound or 80-pound.
What other great...
Wait, I still don't understand. So you were trying to lengthen your bite tippet for this knot.
Go over there and get one.
No. So what it was is originally they had like a bimini twist, but the double line was never butted up against, that next knot that people used, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Nikki, go over there and get
Here.
one of those flies.
Yeah, pull it up.
Then you can see it.
Because I thought the Huffenagel, hold on one second. I thought the Huffenagel was to combine really heavy tippet to really light tippet, and that's when the knot was applicable.
Well, Steve said that he came up with this.
It was tied over the double line after the bimini twist, not light, not 12-pound to, unless we're talking about two different things.
Well, he was originally thinking, when he was fishing with Tom Evans in Panama, they were bill fishing, and they had these big runs. And between these big runs, Steve was trying to figure out, how can I combine light tippet to heavy monofilament for billfish? And how do you connect 2-pound test to, say, 100 or 80-pound test?
But in order to get 100%, it was always had to go through a double bimini, as far as we knew at those days.
You had to have that bimini knot.
Right.
But he said that's when he figured out how to combine that bimini knot through and butt up against the figure 8.
Can you see that? I mean,
yes, I can.
That's one of them.
Oh, you've got a little connection here. So,
well, take it off. I mean, it's just a piece of wire or something.
So, look, here's what we're talking about. In tournament fishing, world record fishing, from the eye of that hook to your class tippet, that's your world record tippet, not this. You have an option of using any size of monofilament or wire. So that's got to be within 12 inches, including the knots. So your Huffenagel, or the knot we're speaking now, combining a bimini twist, through that nail knot or figure 8, butting those two knots together. That's the knot we're talking about.
You see how small that is?
Yes.
In the old days, before people started using that, it was hard to pull it down, and sometimes you'd have this much double line.
Right. So in the past, this bimini was back here, and you had the double line before it was connected here. What was that connection here in the old days?
Oh, a nail knot usually, mostly nail knots.
So similar, but it was just not pulled tight.
Right. I got the idea to tie it down. I mean, you could tie it when you make a double line, you got this much of it.
Right.
So you tie it down here where you got room to work, and then you slid it all the way up and butted it against the bimini wraps. And then in order to keep it there, you just tied some half hitches.
Right. What other inventions or designs that you came up with that no one had at the time?
Well, I don't know. I mean, because I kind of stayed to myself, people could have invented things at the same time.
You just didn't know.
Yeah, I just didn't know.
How did
Flip like that gap I showed you.
Right. So how did
that gap was deadly.
Oh, I'm sure. So Flip Pallet called you the loner. Is he the one who gave you that name?
Yep. And that goes back to the CB radio days. He started calling me the loner because he could never find me, because I was always, and then I'd come in and say, "Hey, Flip, saw you back around Sid Key today." He said, "I didn't see you." And I said, "Well, I knew where you were." And he started calling me the loner because he couldn't find me.
Did you take pride in that?
Yeah.
You named your boat the loner.
Yeah.
You must have.
Yeah. That big boat's named the loner too. I was always kind of a recluse, I guess you might call me, or a loner, because in those days when I grew up down here, the known guides at that time were, Cecil and Jimmy and those guys, and they didn't tell the new guy anything. They sent you in the opposite direction.
I'm going to steal my dad's thunder a little bit here. We were speaking to Timmy Klein on the way down, and he was saying that you helped him out greatly, especially in bonefish and tarpon. He was saying you clued him into a certain area or certain areas, and you would say, when you go in here, go in the afternoon when all the boats are off the water, so no one would see you.
Yeah, so you don't get caught.
That's probably true.
I thought that was interesting, and he said he had that spot. You and him would fish for 10 years until someone actually busted him and found him, and then that's when all the boats started coming in.
Timmy was honorable, not like some of them. Some of them, they would go home and they'd go back to the Lorelei or someplace, and as soon as they got into the beer, their mouth started running.
Right.
And, I caution people today. I said, if you got a good place to fish, keep your mouth shut, because all you're going to do is get company. And I said, they will destroy it for you. They'll destroy it because they'll beat it to death. I mean, in the old days, I had so many places because one of the things I always did in the old days is if all the guides were going to Buchanan Bank or whatever the place to be is, I went the other way. If they all went to Buchanan, I was in Channel 2, I'd go the other way because I figured that whole bay out there, all the fish can't be at Channel 2 or Buchanan.
Right.
I said, I'm going to go out there and learn it. And Steve Huff and I have talked about this many times because we're very much alike in that we believe the only way to learn how to fish and where the fish are and what made them doing is on the push pole. Get on the push pole and pole for miles and do it day after day on all kinds of winds and all kinds of tides. We agree on that.
You know what's if you take a look at the Roland Garros right now, the big tennis match taking place in Paris. Inside the rim of the stadium, there's a big quote on that big rim: "The victor belongs to the most tenacious." I think you could probably fall into that category.
Well, I was pretty tenacious because of my makeup, I learned where fish were that people didn't know about. And I had all these little honey holes back all over the bay that only I knew about in those days until the advent. They started running all over the place. And nowadays you can see one coming and click. You can see them and hit the GPS and you're done.
Harry told me that a lot of the boats were fishing the incoming tide in the back for bonefish. But he thought, I didn't want to be around all these boats. I'd fish these spots during the falling tide. And he said you were one of the only, maybe two other people he ever saw back there on that falling tide.
That may be so. I spent a lot more days there than Harry ever did. I lived at 9 Mile.
In the
that's where Charlie Causey and I caught 32 bonefish in one morning on fly and left them.
Yeah. Charlie Causey mentioned that in the 96 fall fly, the first day he caught, I think, 31 on 9 Mile.
Well, it was 31, 32, something like that.
Yeah, but you didn't fish that tournament, did you, in 96?
I was his guide.
Well, there we go. It's the same story. I didn't realize you were his guide.
I was his guide. Did you interview Charlie?
Not yet.
You got to give Eddie some credit, man.
Well,
come on,
Well,
Dad.
I thought he did it twice. I didn't realize.
I'll tell you, he would be a good guy to do a show on because
for sure.
He's probably fished more permit days than Del Brown nowadays.
Yeah.
And he fished with all the best guides because he could afford it. Mm-hmm. And he retired from Wall Street with, financially well off when he was barely 40.
Yeah.
And his avocation became fly fishing.
I didn't know, because we were fishing. I fished that tournament against you guys, and all of a sudden he jumped in because we caught a couple. Harry Spear and I caught a bunch of big fish that first day. We caught a 13-12 and a 10-12. Then you guys caught 31,
but none of them were big enough. That's why we could have caught more, but because that day But we needed to fish over 8 pounds, so we took off doing it, and we never did catch a big one. So we didn't win.
Right.
Did you have that same passion for permit and tarpon as you did for bonefish?
I never really got heavy into the permit fishing. I mostly fished tarpon and bonefish because I'd never got into going to Key West and what it took to do it. And I thought, in those days, I really liked the bonefish on fly because you had to know your stuff to catch a bonefish on a fly.
Unlike tarpon.
Tarpon were mostly big dumb slobs. You put it in front of their face and do it just right, and they eat it. Not so with the bonefish.
Right. It's. I think Steve has that same feeling. He said, permit or unfair. Tarpon, for the most part, are easy, but the big bonefish are the most demanding fish of all.
I've always told my fly fishermen, I said, they'd say, "Oh yeah, I caught a lot of bonefish." Where did you catch them? I said, and they go like, "Well, in Bahamas," and I go like, "Nothing yet." When you go out and you can consistently catch some big bonefish, Alamorada bonefish downtown, then you can put your hat on.
Right. What kind of flies were you guys using back then for
Well,
bonefish?
it was an evolution.
Right.
We started out with like some of the deceiver type flies and shrimp type flies, and we eventually ended up into the crab type flies, and
Right.
and the toadfish flies, and that's where they finally. I don't know. I've been out of it for 10 years. I don't know what they're using today.
Right.
Did you ever catch a 14 or 15 pounder?
There he is, right over there on the wall. 15.6.
Is that right?
15.6. Wow.
Yeah. With whom?
His name was Peter Costanzo. He was not an angler. He was he was an all-day charter that came from, I don't know where. I can't remember. It's been so long ago. But we had gone. They wanted to go, but he and his wife, and we had gone all the way up the ocean side, and we'd fished all day long and hadn't seen a fish. Hadn't seen a fish. And there's supposed to be some weather coming in, and I'm like Harry. I'd stay out till the last light if that's what it took. And I came back and I said, let's stop up here at Crossbanks on the way home. And it was getting dark. There was a squall coming, and we pulled down the bank, and we saw that there was 2 fish tailing. And the guy threw it out there, and he hooked the fish up, and it ran off the flat. And I said, just let him run out there, and I'll get this other one for your wife. Well, we let this thing, we didn't know it was 15.6, and we just let it swim around out there. And so we went over there, and the wife spooked that one and pushed off the bank, and I finally said, okay, see if you can get him in here. And he pulled him up alongside the boat, and I go like, holy cow, is that a tuna or a football or what is it? That thing was just like that big around. And, we ran it in and went through all the things and waited 15.6.
As a big, passionate bone fisherman, it must have broke your heart when all these fish died in that 2010 freeze.
Oh, it was terrible, yeah. And then in my day, I never thought bonefish would disappear.
Right.
And they virtually did.
They did.
There's a few little ones coming back, but compared to what it was in my day, there were bonefish everywhere. Not that you could go on any flat and catch a bonefish, but if you knew what you were doing.
Mm-hmm. And you consider yourself more of a bone fisherman than a tarpon fisherman, correct?
Yeah, but I could do either.
Yeah.
And I could do either equally as well because, one of the reasons I quit is because it got so congested out there and it got to be so dog eat dog. And in my earlier days, I didn't fish spots. I learned how the fish got to those spots, where they went after they left, and how they got to that spot. I knew where they would go. So in the old days, before it got so crowded, I could literally stay in tarpon all day long. Just by whatever the tide was, just move, and here they were.
Right.
But that vanished with when you had to get a ticket and a place to park a month ahead of time.
Yeah, right.
That didn't get to be any fun.
Yeah.
Then it got to be every time was a screaming match and
mm-hmm.
People having virtual fist fights on the water. That's crazy.
What was the worst screaming match you got into?
I don't remember that one.
Was it?
Yes, you do.
No, I have selective memory when it comes to that. I don't like naming names.
Right. It doesn't matter.
It got to be a daily occurrence.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yep.
Wow.
It still is today.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I know, at least the guys I talk to.
How much did it mean to you to win these big tournaments? You won the Fall Fly, I think it was in '89.
Well, it meant a lot in those days.
And then you won the Gold Cup.
Because it helped build my career and kept me booked.
But it had to have meant a lot to your pride,
Oh, yeah. Well, in those days, most of the tournaments, we started to create business.
Exactly right.
They weren't existing. We created them because we needed some bread on the table.
So what was happening, if I'm not mistaken, everybody would come fish in May during the peak tarpon run, and then they'd leave town. So you guys started these tournaments to get the guys to come back into town in June.
Correct. And that's how the fall bonefish, to get the people here in October.
Mm-hmm.
There was nobody here in October.
Right. How much were you getting paid back then a day?
Shoot. I think I started, it was probably back in those days, probably 300. And then by the time I quit, I always tried to, after I got where I didn't have to worry about clients, I always tried to be $100 more than everybody else. And people will say, well, how come, I can get so-and-so for $100 less? I say, he's worth it. You ought to go there.
It's a great way to put it.
Yeah, I said, I don't want to be, I said, because I think I'm better than, I never said that, but
you knew.
I knew that.
You worked harder.
Yeah.
That's what Harry said. He said there were only a couple of you guys that worked, 10, 11, 12-hour days, and you were one of them.
Yeah.
We
hadn't learned to work smarter instead of longer.
Right. Who were the best fishermen you ever had on your skiff?
Oh, I never had the privilege of fishing with you, but when back in my day, compared to the anglers today, those guys were really very good. They were wealthy people like Carl Navarre, who was a bass fisherman, and they didn't have the skills like you guys do today.
Right, I mean, but you could look at any sport and say the same.
Right.
But the top dogs back then, Carl Navarre, you went to Homosassa with him. Were you guys record fishing up there by chance?
Yeah, we were after the 200-pounder. We took Bill Curtis up there and to fish with little Carl Navarre.
So a lot of people have made the statement that, like Sandy Brett did on the podcast with him, we didn't just go fishing. We were training. We were training to win these tournaments or training to catch these world record fish. Is that the mindset you guys had?
Well, Sandy was a different level than the average rich businessman at the time.
Right.
He was
more serious.
He was serious. He was good. He had what it is. His brother was good too, and Randy. I fished Randy for years, but there was a different level of communication with the fish with Sandy than Randy. Randy was an excellent caster, but Sandy could talk to the fish and make them eat.
Right. I've said this to Nicky and a bunch of people in the last, maybe last year or so, talking about tournaments. The best team is a guide that can find the fish that doesn't want to be found, and the best angler is the angler that can catch the fish that doesn't want to be caught.
And keep his mouth shut.
Not tell anybody. So who was that angler for you? Was Carl? That guy?
Yeah, Carl. I fished Carl for years. I had numerous anglers. And did I have a favorite? I mean, I fished Randy Moret for years. Randy and I were really good friends. Randy was an excellent fisherman. Mm-hmm. He was very good. But I think if I had to judge both of them, and I never got to fish with his brother a whole lot, but I fished a little bit. I mean, and I think that the brother was a little tiny bit better.
Yeah. Did you see a time when you had to...
Don't mean to say I don't want to...
No.
You can take that out of the thing as far as I'm concerned.
Did you see a point in time where all of a sudden you had to feed the fish versus just show the fish the fly?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Do you remember when that was?
Yeah, the fishing on the ocean side. I mean, that's... Especially when the backcountry went dead, everybody was outside, so that doubled the amount of boats and anglers, and the fish just got where they wouldn't bite, not using the same techniques. And went down, I mean, we kept using the same kind of splay wing flies. We just got them smaller and smaller and smaller until I was down to number 1 hooks. And then came the worm fly, and they will get used to that too.
They already are. I can tell you that right now.
I think they're related to the cockroach. No matter what the man does, the cockroach has survived.
Right. So back then, tell us about the Pallola worm hatches, just because 2 nights ago we were out down by Key West and we just collected worms. It was really cool to see them. We didn't even fish. There was a big storm coming. Did you guys get into those worm hatches back in the day?
Yeah, we used to go out into them. It was fun.
I bet it was unbelievable back then.
It wasn't just tarpon. I mean, you get big mangrove snappers sucking them down and all kinds of stuff. It was a real heyday. And, it was a hit or miss. They know more about it than we did in those days. But if you hit it right, it was spectacular.
But did you promote it? Like a client would book you from 5 to 8?
I was booked solid every day anyway. I didn't.
But you would go out there looking for the worm hatch.
Yeah. Jim Brewer and I used to go out there for fun, but I mean, I had such a clientele. I was fishing. There was years I fished 300 days a year, and I just didn't have the energy to do it all night too.
Right.
But in the early days, I would fish the skiff all day long, and then I would probably do 4 to 5 night tarpon live bait fish at the same time.
Wow.
But, I was 30, 35 years old then too.
Sure.
So. And our whole money making season was 4 or 5 months total. So that had to last you for 12 months. Not like today.
Right. You were speaking downstairs about this gaff you made. And I think that you and Charlie Causey were a couple of the guys that really were influential in getting the Gold Cup to be a no-kill tournament, and that's why you stopped fishing the Gold Cup, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
Tell me about that transition.
Well, that's hard to say. I just got where, I didn't like, I killed a lot of fish, don't get me wrong. I've gapped a lot of tarpon in my time, but I just got to the point where I go, it's just wrong to kill these magnificent fish. And then every day hang them on a rack and then tow them out as garbage. You took a magnificent creature like the Silver King and turned it into a piece of garbage. And I just said, I can't be part of that anymore.
How did you guys get
Because I had such a clientele and people waiting. I didn't have to worry about filling the tarpon tournament dates.
Right. Anyway. But
I said I can go out, I can go out and after those guys go home and fish and have a good time and I get paid the same, probably more.
But you were still involved trying to get this to become a no-kill tournament.
Yeah,
even though you had stopped fishing the
Charlie
tournament.
Causey was very instrumental. Bert Sherb was very instrumental in it. And many others.
How many years did it take to get it to change?
I can't.
Couple?
I mean, it was
3?
I
wow.
think it took more than that because there were some entrenched people that fought to kill the fish. They said, some people had the idea, well, I spend a lot of money down here, so I have a right to kill a few.
Where did Billy Pate stand on all this?
I'm not sure. I think Billy was in the, I think Billy would be fishing the same old tarpon tournament today. He wasn't, I don't think he was a proponent of release.
Right.
He probably wasn't against it either, but
right.
I don't know. I was never friendly with Billy. So Billy was I never fished with him.
Who were you tight with? You say you were a loner, but you had to have some tight buddies.
Oh, Billy, Billy was one. I grew up with Billy and Timmy. That's long before his brother Robert started fishing, and Jack Brothers, Earl Gentry. Those people, Cecil Keith.
Yeah.
Never Jimmy. Jimmy, I didn't.
Jimmy Albright.
Jimmy Albright.
What about Jim Brewer?
Jim Brewer was a good friend of mine. I mean, he and I used to fish. We tied our boats up about astern of each other at the Lorelei for many, many years until he died. I remember driving the skip out there and seeing that plane crash. It was just laying there like a big dead whale. It was a what was the guy's name? He was a clerk at Worldwide, and he just got his pilot license and he fitted it with one of those stall kits.
You're right.
And nobody really knew because nobody was around. They figured they were circling some tarpon and they pulled it in too tight of a bank and just
right. And
slipped.
I think the first time I heard about this, they threw a jug with a string and a weight on it, and they got stuck in the tail wing or whatever. But
I don't think that's
but nobody really knows for sure. And they found a plane that was never stuck in it, so I think that was right. They just got too steep and fell through the straw.
They had found some fish that they wouldn't have found otherwise, and they were, where Pelican Keys are.
Yeah,
the plane crashed about 1.5 miles to 2 miles east of the Pelican Keys in that little basin in there. It was only in 4 feet of water. And I never knew there were any tarpon in there because I ran over it a million times going red fishing and backcountry fishing.
Right.
Did you ever, you said you flew over Homosassa dropping those jugs. Did you ever do that in Florida Bay, or was your knowledge already?
I didn't need to.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up in Florida Bay. I mean, I still look back and with no compass or dead reckoning how we could leave here in the dark and run all the way to Sandy Key and be there at dawn with no way to figure out how to get through the finger channels, but we just did.
That's fascinating to me.
And in the early days, if you got there on the low rising tide at dawn, there was rolling tarpon as far as you could see. There were thousands of them, and now they're all gone.
What was the turtle grass looking like?
Just like a thick blanket. You know, the algae blooms didn't. I mean, we didn't start seeing that. I grew up down here. There were no algae blooms. They didn't exist. The backcountry was crystal clear everywhere you went. In the early days, they didn't start showing up till, what was it, 85, 84, somewhere in there. And they started back at Rankin, and then they came this way,
Right.
and they took over the bay. I remember at one of its worst, I was going out in the back. I was going back somewhere, and I went through Twin Keys, and it was a flat, calm day. It was like 8:30 in the morning, and I headed for Rabbit across the bay, and that entire bay was solid, dead, rotting sponges and stink. And algae bloom had killed every living thing in that bay. That was really sad to see, and those things would shift around with the wind.
Sure.
Well, it's pretty amazing to talk to someone who's seen the heyday of Florida Keys fishing.
I remember when some of the tournaments, Charlie and I were always fished the bonefish tournaments together with fly bonefish. And I remember one year we went out and practiced the whole week, and we had it dialed in where to be at what time. And the day of the tournament, the wind switched from the north and blew the algae bloom out of Rankin Bay and covered up everything that we had planned to fish.
Oh, God.
So we just started over from scratch. That stuff would just move around. I remember when there were times when it would go all the way out to Tennessee Reef through Channel 5, Channel 2.
When it was right, did you have a favorite spot back there?
I had 100,000 favorite spots.
Wherever the fish are.
Wherever the fish were. If it weren't there, I knew where to go next.
Right.
But, you know, that was a million hours on the push pole.
You know, because I've been down here almost 35, closing, 38 years, fishing Florida Bay and up the coast and Marquesas and the lower Keys. I like finding fish in certain spots. I like to find fish wherever they are, but there's certain spots that I love. And I remember back with Harry, and the fish would come down 9 Mile Bank, first, second, and third point, and there'd be a big mullet mud out there. You got there, and those big fish are, tailing through all that mud and stuff.
Oh, that was fun.
It was unbelievable. But I've always gravitated to the lower Keys for some reason.
The lower Keys are beautiful. I liken them a lot, especially down around the Contents and down in there. It's a lot like the Bahamas, the
Right.
water quality. It's really clear.
And the color of the
You
bottom.
got, and the
is
bottom,
different.
and you got those big sand veins and the channels running between. It's prettier. If you like the Bahama water, it's prettier than back here. This has its own beauty, but it's
Right.
just different.
How long did it take you to actually retire from this? What was the pain level like? How did it progress? And at what point was it that you said,
I just plain wore out. I think when I got to 65, I've been doing it for 50 plus years, and I just wore out. I was tired of it. It wasn't any fun anymore, and I was getting old. And I'm still eaten up with skin cancers and everything else, because when I grew up in the Keys, nobody paid any attention to skin cancer. Nobody knew what it was. The old timers just kind of rotted away. They didn't know what it was.
I know you see the old photographs of the Gold Cup, and everybody's got these big raccoon eyes, and their faces are just burned.
Yep. And I grew up on Lower Matacumbe, and all the kids' parents that used to tell us to go out and get as black as you could so you wouldn't get sunburned. And we lived in cut-off jeans and no shirt and no shoes. And then I went to guiding, and I started guiding the same way. I never wore a shirt.
How many boats were got there when you first started?
Not very many.
25, would you say?
Yeah, I love to tell this story on Billy Knowles, and you maybe have heard it before. Billy was doing an interview for something, and the commentator said, "Billy, you're born and raised here, and you grew up, and you've been guiding for quite a while." He said, "When you first started guiding, Billy," he said, "how many good guides were there?" And Billy kind of did his Billy thing and goes, "Well, son," he said, "there was probably at the most 5 or 6. And the commentator said, "Well, Billy, it's 25 years later," or whatever it was. He said, "How many good guys do you think there are today, Billy?" And Billy went, "About 5 or 6. Does that sound like Billy?
That does sound. Son.
Son?
I miss him so much.
He was a good guy.
When's the last time you went fishing in Florida Bay, Eddie?
I don't go fishing in Florida Bay anymore. I can't remember. Back when I was guiding, I quit. Nowadays, Carol and I don't even put a rod in the boat. We love to go back and take a couple cold beers and run through the backcountry and just enjoy the scenery and don't worry about fishing.
So 30 years ago?
Oh, no. 10 years ago when I quit guiding. But it's too much work anymore. I mean,
Yeah.
I like to go out and have a reasonable idea that I'm going to catch something.
Right. Is it impressive to you to see Steve Huff still pushing it like 73, 74? Fishing from dark to dark? It's crazy.
It is, but that's Steve.
Yeah.
He'll do that probably till he can't do it anymore. But if you will remember, Steve got to the same point that I was when I quit, but I didn't leave. He got there earlier than I, much sooner than I remember. He left Marathon, sold his house, everything, and moved to Chokoloskee in Everglades City to get away from everybody. Remember?
You're right. He went to find. I asked him once, "What do you like the Everglades?" He said, "Because there's a lot of fish and a lot of fish, mosquitoes, and no people."
And no people. And that's why I remember I said, "Man, you're crazy. You're going to go over there in that damn mosquito-infested swamp." And he said, "Yeah, but there's no people."
Yeah.
No boats. He said that all these new hotshot guides and all these people and all these boats, he said, it's driving me crazy. He said, it just gets me too angry. I got to get away from it.
Yeah.
And he did. He moved out.
Found a new place to find fish.
Yep. But, he took on a different challenge. He got into snook and redfish and getting up in the mangroves. And, I've never been with Steve, but people I know that fish with him say that he's awesome. He'll fish till black dark and run in with no GPS through these creeks wide open and scare the shit out of you. And,
right, with his glasses on.
But he knows where he is.
Right.
Unbelievable.
Did he?
I've
been doing this for a long time, but I think if you took the scope of what Steve Huff knows over the geography he knows, I consider him to be the best fishing guide ever. I did pretty well, but I was in a small geographic area. He could go from Naples to Tortugas.
Did he inspire all of you at that time, or did that inspiration come later?
I started before Steve.
Well, what I'm talking is about at what point did all of a sudden you start finding this great respect as possibly the greatest guide ever? Was there a point where all of a sudden
No, there was no point. It was
just a growth.
Evolution.
Yeah.
Just because he and I think alike and ran our businesses the same way.
Right.
We weren't part of the flock. And it's funny, Steve and I used to, because we thought a lot alike, we'd take off in a bonefish tournament in the morning, pitch black dark. And I'd say, well, I'm going to run up to the crossbank and see. And I'd get there and Steve would be sitting right where I'm going to stop. And he'd go, I beat you again.
Great minds think alike.
Yeah.
Anything that you would like to add to this conversation?
I think that pretty well covers it, other than, my passion today is to try to do what little bit I can and with the means I have to help preserve what we have left, and particularly, the Everglades and the watershed and the nearshore waters. And I think that, I can't do anything much individually, but I can contribute some money to as many organizations that can, and that's what I do.
What would you say to the young guides and anglers that are in the game today to help do what they're supposed to do as far as their footprint in the world of conservation?
I don't know how to answer that.
So what I say...
Because I don't see, obviously, because I'm so long out of the business, I don't know who any of these young guides are.
Yeah.
And I don't know how they operate. And it seems to me like the ones that I do know, and they're more interested in how many hits they get on their website than they are anything else. But that's not fair at all,
right?
For sure.
Well, I was asked that question a couple of days ago, and I said the only thing that I know what I can do, we can think like with BTT, we think globally but act locally.
Correct.
And what BTT has done is really fascinating. With the Caribbean Rim, the Bahamas, they've established 6 state parks. They just got the Western Dry Rock shut down. All I know is where I don't want to fish, where the fish are really in their sensitive state. Maybe Bahia Honda Bridge at the Worm Hatch, you got 60 boats on top of these fish. You take a look at Boca Grande over there. Anglers are hooking 11 tarpon and losing 6 of them to sharks. So what I'm saying here to people who may be listening, maybe even freshwater fishing or fishermen, fishing over spawning, rainbow trout. Stay away from these sensitive places because these fish need to do what they need to do to procreate. And for some reason, these fish, these big, massive tarpon, need to eat worms, whether it be the protein for the spawn, because it's the full moon, and right after these worm hatches, they go offshore and spawn. Nikki and I are really trying to think where we should really be ethical and try to be conscious. And that's all I have to say about that statement. But still,
I can comment a little bit on that. That's you've arrived there in the process of evolution over a lot of years, and you've seen the decline in the resource. And you gotta, like you said, you gotta think beyond just going where most of the fish are, and you gotta think about what about the fish 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And logically, you would think, well, in the old days, when all the commercial fishermen, everybody would go when the spawns, that's when you went fishing because you could
catch them easily.
Yeah, and the commercial fishermen, that's when they'd slaughter them. The mutton snapper and everything down off of Key West. That's why they had to close the dry rocks, because they were getting so depleted. Places like that. And I think the main thing that I would say is, what can you do? Do whatever you can to change the thinking, because it all revolves around the thinking. You got to change the thinking. And you change the thinking to preserving instead of hanging it on a nail and beating yourself on the chest. And you remember back in the old days off of Key West, they measured a good day by how many pounds they sold.
Right.
Not what a great day they had. Oh, and you had these people coming out of Miami running their restaurants supposedly on their fun boat. So you remember, you've been around long enough where the catch and release today has become the way to fish, other than meat fishing, of course. But people today wouldn't, they honor the catch and release because they understand it. But that came over an elevation of probably since the beginning of the Hawley tournaments and things like that. That's what, 30 some years?
Right.
That didn't happen overnight. But the more people you get involved and the more people you change the thinking to, the faster it will
progress.
It'll progress.
Here's one of the things that really bothers me is, when up in, Palm Beach area, you see these boats going offshore dolphin fishing. Why do they have to come in? Why is the limit like 9 fish per person? They come back with 30, 40, 50 dolphin.
It's 10 fish per person.
It's just just catch enough that you need for your family. Why, I just feel terrible that you have, that's one boat. If everybody does that, and then they wonder why there's not a lot of really big dolphin anymore.
Because the thinking hasn't gotten there yet. And our state doesn't back it up. Why? I can't understand why the state of Florida has catered to the commercial fishing industry forever. It lets them get away. I remember when they were wiping out the redfish, and the Guides Association, we chartered Greyhound buses and bussed everybody to Tallahassee to get them to stop it. And we actually got it stopped at that particular time because the redfish were getting slaughtered, and they were using the spotter planes and whatever it took.
Well,
but they're not, the state has backed them. And today I go out with my friend and we go out yellowtail fishing, and I go out there and I'm allowed, in federal waters, I'm allowed to keep 10 yellowtail per person per day. There's a commercial guy sitting over there, and if he catches 1,500 pounds today, he can keep all 1,500 pounds. Not that he can catch 1,500, and then he can go out and do it again the next day. I've gotten to the point where I've changed my thinking. I used to kill everything too. I'm just as guilty as everybody else. But the thinking wasn't there in those days. And there was plenty of resource. The resource has gotten skimmed now.
Right.
And what's, you go back to the state laws and they say, well, you can do so many, and they put bag limits and so on. But what they don't take in, it goes, that bag limit might stay in, let's just take a round number, 5 years, 10 years. But the population that's fishing has quadrupled or 5 times in that same 5 years.
Right.
And the bag limits don't reflect that. So what happens to the fish population? Gets decimated.
Right.
And, you take you mentioned the mahi or the dolphin, there's hardly, I grew up down here, there were so many, you could go out there any day and sink the boat if you wanted to.
Right.
And now they're lucky to find any little ones, hardly any big ones. And you know why? If you go, I can see why, because there's the commercial industry is slaughtering the mahis worldwide. And they're being caught off these big factory boats, these long line boats, and they're setting 30, 40 miles of lines every day, and they're setting them at 5 levels. They didn't used to fish the surface level. Now they fish for the mahi, and they go all the way to the bottom to the whatever they want. And you can go into, next time you go into your local supermarket, look in the fish in the fish case. You can go into any supermarket, and I've done this in Aspen. In other places, they got fresh mahi for $7.99 a pound. Now, think about how many, if you take just the supermarkets in the United States, how many pounds does it take to fill those cases every day?
Right. That's a scary number.
The fish can't survive it.
No. Do you want to hear something very disrespectful?
I don't know.
You want to hear it?
I'll hear it.
Just go with it.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm driving up here today to speaking about dolphin, and Nikki's going to fly out to Aspen on the 10th of June, and I'm going to stick around, till around the 20th. And I told Nikki, I said, I think after you leave, I'm going to go offshore and maybe catch a dolphin or something for dinner. And Nikki says, you got no chance of catching a dolphin. He said, you're going to go out there and you can have a big boat, you can have a long lines or short lines, the outriggers. You're not going to catch anything. That's how bad you are. You're going to go out and you're going to see a dolphin chasing, or you're going to see a frigate bird coming down over some bait and some flying fish, and you're going to go, wow, isn't that a cool bird? That's the kind of respect I get from him.
Do I speak like that? What kind of accent was that? That was terrible.
Your kids always say stuff you don't want them to say.
In response.
Anyway, no response. You just don't have you might have a feel in the fly fishing game, but no feel when you go offshore. You go out of the inland, you go, where the hell do I go?
Throw everything, including the kitchen sink, in the water and drag it around.
Oh, my dad can have 1,000 pilchards in his live well. He won't come back with anything.
There we go.
He won't come back with anything.
There we go. See, it's just,
that's why he catches tarpon, because he's good at it.
Yeah.
They can't catch anything else.
Well, Eddie, I've heard your name so many times. I've seen your name on trophies, in Sandy's shop, and it's just, your legend just keeps on growing. It's great to meet you.
You're sure welcome. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Much. I guess a legend means you used to be pretty good at something, but you're still alive.
I'd rather
Thank you. Thank you. Always good to see you.
Like I've always said about that legend thing, to other people, they say, well, I'd rather be a has-been than a never was. Sorry.
I got one that I just came to mind. This was attributed to a guy that was supposed to be the guru of trout fishing in streams. I think it was Pennsylvania or Northeast or something like that. And it said, to achieve mastery is to rise above the need to catch fish. I read that and I go, wow, that is really awesome. It doesn't say want. It says need.
Right.
And I had a plaque made, and I put it on my console, on my skip, that big. And people would read it, and they'd go like, what the hell is that? I hope I don't ever get where I don't want to catch a fish. I said, you didn't read the sign. What do you mean? I said, it doesn't say want. It says need. And the people who need to catch it, or they've had a bad day, they don't enjoy the fishing, and they don't understand what it's all about.
That's why I got out of tournaments.
That's why.
That's what made me I feel pretty good at it is because I wanted to be that guy that could catch a fish on any given day. I wanted to win tournaments. So having that kind of a mindset, I would have never gotten that good or you that good if you didn't want to win that tournament.
That's correct. It's
right?
Process of evolution, what we talked about earlier.
But now here we are.
Now we're at a point where we've got that
it.
experience. Now we need to do what we can do. And you're in a position with your podcast to do that, to change the thinking and to help elevate the thinking to where we are now and not be stuck for the 30 years that it took us to get there.
Right.
And I think that's possible, but it's a thing of numbers.
How do you feel about all that? I mean, here you are 27 going on 28 and hear a bunch of old farts talking about this stuff, need and having wisdom now that we don't need it, but we gravitated to a point of maybe peace where when I was in the middle of tournaments, I had no peace.
What's that old saying? Too soon old and too soon, what is it? And not old enough or smart or something. It's an old German song. I forgot what it was.
No, but I get the gist of that. Yeah.
Well, I'm not there yet, just because I haven't been doing this as long as you guys have been. Maybe when I'm your age, I'll feel the same way. But the fishing, in my eyes, the fishing is still good. There's a lot of boats on the water, but I've only been doing this for 15 years, so in my short time down here, it hasn't changed all that much. It's changed a little bit, but it's still good enough that
it's great.
I want to be on the water and I want to get, a couple shots and maybe catch a fish a day. If we catch a fish a day, that's a great day.
Yeah.
And, when I'm, your age and I've been doing this for 40 years, I might feel the same way. And I totally understand how you guys feel, but also too, it's become cool. Conservation has become cool in the younger generation. Because guys like you, 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds, who look up to you and Steve Huff and Harry Spear and all these legends, are talking about conservation. They're talking about what has changed in their life. And the younger generation is catching on to that. And they're more aware, I would say. I think that's the right word. They're more aware, they're more conscious, and they want to make a difference in the environment, in their everyday lives. And that's the future, and that's one of the most important things right now.
Keep changing the thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It all comes back to what you said. Yeah, sure.
You got to keep changing the thinking. You have to promote conservation, and that has to become the cool thing.
Right.
If it becomes the cool thing, then they'll accept it.
Exactly right.
But the old thing. I mean, in the old days, the whole thing was how many fish could you put in the box.
Right.
But that thinking is. Well, it still holds true offshore, but
yeah. Well, anyway,
I remember back when we were allowed to sell fish. Back then there was lots of trout in the backcountry, and we had a meeting one time at the Guides Association, and we voluntarily, as an association, agreed to stop selling all fish, and we never sold it. To my knowledge, a member never sold a fish after that, because we mandated it, that we were going to be part of the movement, not all of the problem.
Right.
But here too, I think, in wrapping this up, I think that's what's really good about certain associations like the Lower Keys Guides Association, the Upper Keys Guides Association, tournaments,
Captains for Clean
Water.
BTT.
You have a group of people that really have a great discussion about the things and the issues at hand. But like the tarpon tournament, you guys all got together and said, we're not going to do this anymore. But without the Army that all these groups have, nothing can get done. But I think with the most important thing, like you're talking about now, getting the younger people thinking and taking a closer look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, I came to the conclusion. I used to, again, we come back. You take the movement to help to save the Everglades and the Captains of Clean Water and all the rest of them. That came because of the crisis, the algae crisis.
Right.
It didn't come without it. And when you have a crisis like that, it mobilized the armies. And I decided that instead of giving to $1,000 to one, I would give $500 to 10 of them.
Right. That's what I do as well.
Because I'm the president of this homeowners association. We have 70 members. And I started 3 months ago, I started sending all the stuff from Captains of Clean Water and Everglades Society and those to our members and encouraging them all to join and encouraging them there. And I reached 70 people, 70 different families that way. And whatever their ripple effect is, I made them aware, because a lot of these people are doctors and lawyers and industries, and they don't really know.
Right.
But if I can put it in front of them and they can see that these organizations are doing a good job, and I stress all the time, it's not so much the dollars, it's the numbers. They need lots of votes. And in order to be voting, you have to be a member. And the more members you got, the more Tallahassee listens.
Right.
Change your thinking. I like it.
Well, thank you. It's
Thank
a great
you so much,
subject
Eddie.
to finish up on.
Glad I threw that out.
One more time, buddy.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks so much. Great
Mickey,
to meet
thank
you, Eddie.
Don't stop fishing.
Good fun.
What I saw is West Side Story. What I saw is just a